person who controls the electromagnetic spectrum controls the battlefield. And the fact that these things are nearly on the way hopefully will make the Kremlin and the Russians think twice. It really increases Ukraine's capability to strike deep. And what we've seen, the deep strikes into Russia are making the difference. President Putin, for the first time, admitted in public that Russia was in trouble. Well, I think there are two really important things to look at here. First of all, the one-way effectors. These are drones or missiles that can travel considerable distances. And I think that this is part of what's called Project Breakstop, which is a UK sort of consortium, UK companies working with the Ukrainians to produce these one-way effectors. And these are, in effect, missiles or drones that can travel between 500 kilometers up to 1,000 kilometers or even further into depth targets, but with a decent payload. There are three companies competing for this particular project at the moment, between about 200 and 300 kilogram weight. So, up to a quarter of a ton. That's pretty significant. You can put some really powerful warheads on that at that sort of level. So really important. People were seeing the $500 FPV drones that basically drop a 2-kilogram hand grenade down the hatch of a tank. Great. But this is really where warfare is going. This is what Ukraine is having tremendous success with. Lots of people will remember and know of the Storm Shadow missile, the British missile. It's a similar sort of idea, again, highly capable at distance. Now, one of the issues with Storm Shadow is that it's got US tech in it. And we've learned that we need sovereign capability so that we don't have to ask the Americans, whether we can use these things. And part of Project Breakstop is that it's all sovereign British, so we don't need anybody else's help there. The other element to it is the speed. So everybody knows about the British military procurement system, something like Ajax recce vehicle, like tank, 10 years in the making and 6 years late. It is usually in military procurement, we talk in years. Now, what we're learning from Ukraine is actually we can do this in months. And that is the whole thing about this project is to, it's only about 18 months in train at the moment. And the reports that we're seeing in the press this week and the end of last week is actually the kit has been tested. These weapons have been tested. The other thing to say about them, we've discussed it before, the person who controls the electromagnetic spectrum controls the battlefield. And there have been huge issues as things have moved forward. Electronic jamming has affected a lot of these cheap drones because they're easy to take down. And when it comes to sophistication, missiles like Storm Shadow and Taurus are able to evade the sort of jamming devices. And these weapons very much manage to overcome it because they are sort of directed to the vicinity of their targets. And we said they could be 1,000 kilometers away. And then through artificial intelligence, they're then piloted onto it. So a lot of people have passed the calls them kamikaze drones, but they can hit a precise target. We're not talking about meters here. We're talking about, a pinpoint. And if you can do that, as we've seen very recently, in the last few weeks, Ukraine has hit some really important sites, Russian missile factories. Of course, the oil industry is pretty much destroyed, and they brought Crimea to its knees. So these are exactly the type of capabilities. The difference between Storm Shadow and these one-way effectors is price. So these weapons are about £300,000 to £400,000 a pop, rather than millions. So again, it's something we're learning with Ukraine is actually massive drones, massive air defense is really important. But if your air defense weapon is costing $1 million, then you're quickly going to run out of them. And the sort of modus operandi, the concept of operations, these one-way effectors, is to use them en masse. So using hundreds at a time, as we've seen with the Ukrainians recently, And that, if they don't all get through, it doesn't matter, because the ones that don't get through are sucking up all the Russian air defense. And the ones that do, because they're so precise and they've got a decent warhead, are having the effective target end that you want. So a really good innovation. And I suppose the final thing to say on this is, as we look for the defense investment plan tomorrow or sometime this week, and we look at the capability we in Britain need moving forward, this is exactly what we need, and this is exactly what we must spend our money on. Flexibility is a key word here. Launching from fighter jets that cost hundreds of billions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars and pounds, which are in short supply and become very vulnerable. If you can fire these things off mobile vehicles, it might be a Land Rover that costs you, 20, 30,000 pounds rather than 20 or 30 million dollars, as it were. So really good, and you much more difficult to interdict by the enemy. So ideally, the enemy will take out the launchers. But if they're small and mobile and they don't require airfields, it becomes even more difficult. And the fact that you can, it's again, mass launch many of them. If we used the same sort of modus operandi on Storm Shadow as we're using on these one-way effectors, we'd use up decades of capability. Whereas these things, easy to make, can be made in huge numbers and launched from virtually anywhere. I'm sure that they could probably be launched in aircraft as well, but the sort of point is, why bother if you don't need to? And a lot of the way that these weapons get to their target, as does Storm Shadow, is flying low and sort of sticking close to the ground, where it's very difficult for radars and others to pick them up. So it makes a hell of a lot of sense. But this is the sort of innovation we're seeing coming out of Ukraine, which is absolutely phenomenal. They always say during war, technology and innovation and the way you fight changes very quickly. Well, we are seeing that. And I know that the British military are trying to learn as much as possible, but actually making one of the key weapons that's come out of this will stand us in good stead, and will ensure that we'll have this sort of capability at hand that you could, we talk up, my recent book about tanks and what tanks again look like in the future. Actually, you have very few manned tanks, but a lot of autonomous vehicles and tanks and other things firing these missiles as well, increasing their capability and utility. The fact that we're talking about it and the fact that these things are nearly on the way, hopefully will make the Kremlin and the Russians think twice. Maybe it is enough for them to say, right, now is the time for a peace deal, because Russia's not doing the same. That Russia is still relying on sophisticated, very expensive stuff, and they're relying on manpower. And as we're learning, you just can't do that. The massive drones that and a lot of them that Ukrainians have produced themselves, the Flamingo cruise missile that they produced, again similar to this, but even more expensive. So although £400,000 might seem expensive to people, it's not. And basically, for one cruise missile, you're getting 20 of these things, and one cruise missile could be shot down, but 20 of these things are not going to be shot down, and they have the same sort of effect at target end. So I think that is the thing. It really increases Ukraine's capability to strike deep. And what we've seen, the deep strikes into Russia are making the difference. We only have to look at Crimea, state of emergency declared on Friday because the power's gone out. There's no fuel there. Crimea is a big place. There are a lot of people there. And they are in absolute dire straits. This could be the straw that breaks the Russian camel back, Crimea, because Ukraine has destroyed a lot of logistics supplies in the Donbass. They're all having to come through the Crimea, but now there's no fuel, and the only way onto the Crimea now is the Kerch Bridge. And you hear daily from bots and people on the social media in Ukraine saying, don't go on the Kerch Bridge because we're going to flatten it. And a lot of people are really concerned. The last time I looked, there were 3,500 cars trying to get out of Crimea. So it's this sort of targeting seems to be really successful. Whereas the Russians just putting soldiers in the front line. Again, we heard over the weekend they're still losing 30,000 soldiers a month, which is unsustainable. And it looks like Putin's going to have to order direct and general conscription, which is almost unpalatable even for the Russians. But if they could replicate what we're seeing in Project Breakstop with these weapons, low cost, very capable, high numbers, then that's going forward. And the fact that they're being developed by 3 British companies is fantastic, and it just underwrites what a good defense industry we have in this country, which is why we need to invest in it. Most importantly, so that we've got a credible conventional deterrence, but also to help growth in the economy itself. We are at a really key point in this war at the moment. Only yesterday, President Putin, for the first time, admitted in public that Russia was in trouble and was really suffering from these Ukraine attacks. Now, people like myself and probably you who followed this war in great detail thought we'd never ever hear anything like that. That's completely un-Putin. Now, for President Putin to be saying this means that things are really flipping desperate. And as we said, there's no fuel in Crimea at the moment. Russia is not making enough fuel for itself, let alone exporting. And the Russian economy is based on exporting millions and billions of barrels of oil in order to service its economy. But it can't even produce enough to keep its own sort of lights on and tanks running at the moment. So we are at a key time. Intelligence officials that I've spoken to reckon that Putin is more vulnerable than at any time, even during the Prigozhin mutiny, which was 3 years ago. So I think we're coming to a crux. Putin's got to decide what he does. And we hit the mood music and his suggestions in the last week or so that he's ready to negotiate. Now that I think that is a sign of how successful Ukraine's being. But he sort of said we're ready to negotiate on the Alaska summit sort of terms. Well, the war is very different now than it was in the Alaska summit. Ukraine's on the front foot, is making ground, and it's if there is, I think everybody wants a peace deal, but you want a just one for Ukraine. Now, can there be some arrangement where Ukraine does get back some of the land it's lost, probably not all of it, and there can be a just and lasting peace? Ukraine's in a really good position, I think, going forward. Its defense industries are probably some of the best in the world at the moment, and they're producing kit that absolutely everybody wants. So I don't think growth will be a problem in Ukraine. But they have suffered. They were the ones who were invaded and attacked. It's their cities that are being attacked, and lots of Ukrainians have been killed by the Russians. So for no fault of their own. So it's going to be a really difficult negotiation. Let us hope that President Trump realizes there's a real opportunity to end this war and to get a just peace for Ukraine. So a very long answer to the question, where are we at the moment? From Putin is telling us he's in trouble. Russia's in trouble. Now, this is the best time I think, to get a just peace deal for Ukraine. And President Zelensky is in no hurry to stop the fighting. And sort of why would he? Because he is really beginning to pay the Russians back for their illegal invasion and a war that has now lasted longer than the First World War.